Morning, I'm Rory and welcome back to Sawyer Academy. Today we're going to be talking about proper log orientation. Now if logs were perfectly round and a perfect cylinder, we would have 360 different options of how we can orientate that log, and it wouldn't really matter where we started. Now most logs are far from perfect, and there'll be three things that we need to consider when positioning our log to start cutting it. And that's going to be sweep, geometry, and where our small and large diameters are. So let's start with sweep. So sweep is going to trump everything else. Sweep is going to be the main consideration when we're positioning our logs. And what sweep is most logs look something like this. This is just my example piece. They're going to look like a banana or a rainbow or a smiley face depending on your perspective. But this is what sweep is. They have a crook to them. Usually not this extreme, but in some cases it's very extreme. But regardless, most logs will have some form of sweep to them. What sweep is going to make are horns on the bottom, a belly on the top, and if we look at it from head on, it's going to give us generally two parallel faces. These parallel faces are where we want to start a log. So what sweep does, it takes, rather than having 360 different starting points, it's going to give us two best options. And that's going to be, in this case, what we call belly up, or what we're going to call horns up. That way, one of these parallel faces is going to be referencing our saw line. In this case, we're going to be having a vertical saw. So we want one of these faces to reference that vertical saw to start on face one. So either belly up or horns up. Why we want horns up or belly up is that way after our first and second face, that will define what our cant size for this log is going to be. And since these two parallel faces are generally the same size, after one or two sideboards off of each, we're going to end up with a cant size that is the full length of this log. If we were to start our face one with, let's say, the belly or the horns, you would have to take a significant number of more cuts off each of those faces to get down to a cant size that was the full length of a log. And if a log has enough sweep, you would never be able to make a cant size long that was the same length as your log. So if you had a 16-foot log with a lot of sweep, if you start with your horns or your belly, you will never make a cant size because you'll literally just cut through the whole log. And what that looks like is if you start with your belly, you're going to end up with having to trim off both ends. You won't end up with a nice square cant. You'll find that the ends are always going to be, you're going to have wane, and then you're going to have to trim off 2 feet. So that's why we're always going to start face one and face two on these parallel faces with, again, belly up or horns up. There are also something that I like to call double swept logs, which are rare, but they do happen. So what that means is, in this case, this log is swept in like the X and Y axes, but perfectly straight. Double swept logs are going to be still swept in the X and Y axes, but also in the X and Z axes. And what that really looks like is more of a helix shape, like a corkscrew. The whole log is going to be kind of corkscrew. In that situation, I always figure out which way is my more aggressive sweep and treat that like a normal log. The downside to a double swept log is you may have to take more sideboards off face one and two. As well, you're probably still going to end up with losing maybe 2 feet off your small diameter log. But there's no real way around it. If it's really bad, but if your log is long enough, you may want to take the time to cut your log in half, and rather than doing a full 16 foot, do 2 8-foot, and you'll get more pieces at 8 feet and 8 feet than you would 16 feet overall. It's something to consider. In commercial band sawmills, I should say, the easiest way to see sweep is as the log rolls down the stop and load onto the carriage, you'll literally watch the log roll, and you can see where the horns and bellies are as it's rolling. And then from there, position how it sits on the carriage. Now, it does and it doesn't matter whether or not you're belly up or horns up. When you load onto a carriage, the main thing to consider is where you're going to be on phase 3. So we're talking phase 1 and phase 2. When we get to phase 3, our cants, we've defined our cant and now it's laying on its side. When we get to phase 3 with a carriage, typically I find it better to always be belly out towards our saw line. That way we have 2 points of contact on our carriage, and it's not going to rock as we're trying to position with if we did horns out and belly in. So to summarize that, if we start belly up on phase 1, we'll end with belly out on phase 3. And if we start with horns up on phase 1, we'll end with horns out on phase 3. So that really takes us from 360 options down to 2 main ones. And then in your application, in my case, I'm always going to be orientating belly up. So really every time I load a log onto a carriage, I have one best possible way to orientate that log for my applications. And yours might vary, but they'll follow these guidelines more or less. I'll show a video of what that looks like now. In a different type of sawmill called a scrag sawmill, which you may have watched a video on already. Generally the Sawyer, you'll be sitting looking down the length of the saw line, so you're going to be looking at the end of every log as it progresses through 2 vertical saws at the same time. Before it goes through a saw, usually a computer will turn each log for you. If you don't have a computer that will turn that for you, what you'll have are 2 vertical pineapple rollers, which will grab the side of the log and twist it up and down 180 degrees either way to end up with horns down. And why you always go horns down in a scrag sawmill is so that you have 2 points of contact as the log goes through your saws. If you were to process the log belly down, the log would literally rock as it goes through the cutting tools. So you always want to go horns down in a scrag sawmill. So now how does that apply to portable sawmills? So when we're talking portable sawmills, I'm going to assume we have a horizontal band mill that has a bed. And regardless of how you load that log onto the bed, whether it's a tractor or hydraulics or a cant hook and a ramp or whatever, you'll always want to take the time to rotate that log to an ideal start point. And again, the same thing applies. It's going to be, you're going to want your horns and your bellies to be pointing off to your sides, and your flat parallel face parallel with your saw. Again, that's assuming you have a horizontal saw. So the next thing to consider is going to be log geometry. And like I said earlier, sweep is always going to trump anything else, but another thing to consider is going to be log geometry. And what I mean by that is every log is going to have a small and end diameter, or a small and large end diameter. So we're going to have a small end and we're going to have a large end. But inside of those, well, let's talk small end to start with. Generally, what you're going to see is you're going to have, let's say it's going to be 10 inches up and down, but it's only going to be 8 inches left to right. So what you'll end up with is basically oval shaped logs. Most logs are oval shaped in some way, but some get to an extreme that they're very noticeable, and those we want to capitalize on every time we get an oval shaped log. So if we consider the same log just orientated, the other way, ideally we want to cut our face 1 and face 2 off the narrow face. That way we can get to our desired cant size with fewer boards. So in this case, we're going to cut our slab off, 1 board, slab off, 1 board, the other way. And we're going to end up with, let's say, an 8-inch cant size. In this case, it's going to be an 8-inch cant. Once we make that 8-inch cant, we're going to be able to produce a lot of our desired products out of that cant. Where if we would have started the same log in the other orientation, it would take a significant amount of more cuts to end up with that same 8-inch cant size, while producing more undesirable jacket boards and then fewer of our desired products in the middle. So whenever we get an oval shaped log that doesn't have a lot of sweep to it, we can capitalize on it by starting on the narrow side and not necessarily on the wide side of it. Now we're going to be covering cant sizes and choosing what we're going to cut out of the logs in a different video, but I just want to touch on these oval shaped logs. What we can do with them is capitalize on them. So let's say, for example, we have an order for 2x12, but we're getting very few logs in a day that we can make a 12-inch cant out of. So most of our logs, let's say, are 12-inch and under, but we're presented with this log. In this case, it's going to be 12 inches wide, and it's going to be 14 inches long. This is looking down the length of the small diameter log. So this is going to be looking at it kind of from this orientation. With these logs, you can never make a 12-inch cant out of a 12-inch log. But what we can do is, if we lay it down, we can do what's called skinnying out. We can skinny out a 12-inch cant out of, like, let's say, a 14-inch log. So what that means is, generally you're not going to take any sideboards off face 1 and 2. So this is going to be face 1, this is going to be face 2, and what we're going to be left with is going to be our 12-inch cant out of a 14-inch log, let's say, with no sideboards. What that'll allow us to do is then take that cant size, and out of the middle, again in this example, let's say we're going to skinny out 3 pieces of 6/4 12 that we wouldn't have otherwise been able to get if we were to cut the log in the other orientation. The downside to doing this is that you produce a significant amount more sideboards, which will come down to the pros and cons of how badly do we need these 2x12s. The last thing we need to consider is where our small and large diameters are. In a commercial sawmill, it doesn't matter so much. Our carriages and saws can usually cut in both directions. And the logs that come to us in a random orientation, small end first, large end first, and it doesn't really make a difference. Where it does make a difference is with portable sawmills. With portable sawmills, again, we're assuming horizontal band mills, usually only cut in one direction. So you're going to cut in the direction, you're going to bring the carriage back, lower your cutting head, cut in the same direction, bring it back. If you can start always with your small end, so you're always going to be starting from your small end, cutting away towards the big end, you'll always be cutting within the log. You'll always be making what's called a diverging cut. If you were to start at your large end and cut towards your small end, you'll be making what's called a converging cut. And another way to think about that is, if you have, let's say we're looking at the end of a log, and within, so this will be our large diameter looking down it. Our small diameter is, if our taper is correct, our small end is always going to be within the large end. So when we're starting our cut, we're always going to be starting right at the small end. Any cut we make on that small end is always going to be within the large end. So as we're pushing through that log, if we start, we'll be making a diverging cut that's only going to get wider and thicker as we go. If we were to cut from the large end towards the small end, our cut will be getting narrower and thinner as we progress through, to the point where, let's say we start on the end of the large end, and we start somewhere around here, we'll literally miss half the log, and we might not make a board long enough that will justify cutting on our mill. So we always want to take the time, if we can, while we're stockpiling our logs, to have the small end closest to where we'll be operating from. That way we're always cutting through our log. That's all I have on log orientation. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.